So I hope you've been enjoying the session so far this morning. We're about to carry on with another session that is, we've asked all of our presenters today to think about the rule book and follow the rules, and so we have invited Conrad Kovalitz to come, and he's decided he wants to break them instead. So over to you, Conrad.
Thank you.
Make a mess of the rule, please.
Okay. So I've been coming to these sorts of seminars and talks for years, and I was talking to somebody earlier about, I've been in IT now for about 30 years, and we're still talking about the same things. Is it adding any value? And David was actually arguing with me earlier about how it doesn't need to add value, it just needs to have some value. But after being an IT manager for many years, I ended up in data protection. I ended up in information security for a local authority. And when I was doing that, what I was trying to do was say, right, whatever we're buying, whatever we're using, it's got to add value, because there's things that it does for the organization. And local authorities, like lots of people, buy other people's products. So they don't code their own stuff. So we've been hearing about platform as a code. We've been hearing about contracts this morning. I've heard about ISO 2001 next door. So I've got a security background, but I want to reduce risk, deliver value. Now, are there anybody here from an SME, small organization? Okay, and do you sell to the local authorities and public sector? Okay, so some of this will be valuable to you. For the rest of you, I presume you have security people or contracts people who will check all the stuff that I'm going to say they don't check properly. So what I'm talking about here is cheating on both sides. So when should a small organization say, yes, we are ISO 27001, when they're not? Probably when they're selling to an organization who hasn't got anybody who can check that. That's a good time to cheat on that one. And when is it appropriate that an organization, large organization, does buy a product, but doesn't check that their procurement people have checked that the security is right? So we've heard from Vicky just now about platform as a service, and sorry, platform as code. I think it's brilliant. We've heard from Di earlier in the keynote about specifications. And what I wanted to go was, let's go back to the basics. I've seen loads of examples where the basics have been missed. And if you're a small to medium organization, you've missed the basics, then actually you could get caught out quite easily. And if you're a large organization, you've missed the basics, you could get caught out. So I'll kind of pick up right at the end about the sort of things you'll get caught out. I don't think you will get huge monetary penalties. I think it will be embarrassing. So I'm just going to go through. I'm probably going to skip through a few of these because I just kind of want to pick up on the basics and why, or which basics you can do and which basics you can't do. So that's basically what I am. I've worked in IT for a long time. I've done some data protection and I've done some information security. And I also worked a lot, networked a lot in the public sector with these sorts of organizations, which, like the local government association, provides best practice. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about, they informed what I found. Some of it I informed them, but mostly people like the Walk for Yorkshire and Humber, where I was based, they're the people who actually created a lot of this sort of guidance. And we've just isolated that with both groups of people here. Lots of people will go into a lot of definitions, and we were talking earlier about in specification. What do you do? How do you do it? And then lots of people today are going to be talking about risk. So for business, what's the risk of not being able to deliver something that they deliver. And that's kind of my view in plain English about what we're talking about, but lots of the blank faces suggest that stuff things confusing people. So from my perspective, there's a risk of doing something and the risk of not doing something. And if you don't do something, then you might, so let's say you don't produce your widget, then you won't sell it, you won't stay in business. But if you are tempted to make a new widget, but you think it's too risky to make that new widget, all you're missing out is on the additional cost or the additional revenue from that new widget. So there's kind of this, risks are fairly simple. If you actually do the widget wrong, so if you're a scaffolder and you put up scaffolding without following or without a license to do so, then health and safety will come down on you like a ton of bricks and fine you or send you to prison. So dependent on what the risks are of doing or not doing something has a big bearing on whether you do it or not. So when you're an organization and you are going to buy a widget or a service off another organization, then you want to know that all the things that they're doing right. And if you're a small organization, maybe not a small organization, but I'm used to dealing with small organizations, you want to be doing everything right so that a customer will say, yeah, you're doing everything right, we'll buy it off you. And so those are the things that are dead easy to get wrong. And if you get any of these things wrong, there will be an implication to you of getting those things wrong. Quite a strong implication. I'm going to skip over that because that's too technical. Is anybody technical here? Underpinning my approach, and we were talking about this just at the last moment, I'm technical, so I find it really difficult to talk to business people because fundamentally business people talk about profit, bottom line, lack of risk, and I say, well, you're using that bit of software and that bit of software is out of date. So how do you marry those two? And that's what that reminder is for me, not for you. So one of the previous ITAM suppliers was talking ISO 27001, which is a standard for security. And if you're doing business in the UK, if you're doing business in the public sector or for local authorities or NHS, they actually state that you have to have cyber essentials. So your organization must be cyber essentials certified. And there's two flavors of cyber essentials. There's cyber essentials and cyber essentials plus. Cyber essentials is you fill in a spreadsheet. It costs you about 250 quid, I think. You fill in a spreadsheet and you say, I'm doing all this stuff. And Cyber Essential Plus is about 1,000 quid, and somebody comes in and audits you and checks that you are doing what you said you've done. So why do they say Cyber Essentials is good enough if you can lie? The answer is obviously the government wants you to lie. So that's okay. That's fine. If you
the current government is, but yes.
if you want to process payments, PCI DSS is the standard that you need to have. If you want to connect or use healthcare data, then the standard is the Data Protection Security Toolkit. If you are a local government, then the standard is Future for Network Government, used to be Public Service Network. And if you're really big, ISO 27001. And all of those also have these laws underpinning them. And some of these laws, like GDPR, has fines associated with it. which means that you can actually have a cost associated with it. So these sorts of things, if you don't conform with the standard, they'll say you can't connect to us, you can't use us, so you wouldn't get that contract. Cyber Essentials say if you haven't got Cyber Essentials, you can't contract with us. And I tried to get my council to get Cyber Essentials Plus, and we couldn't get it. We talked about this in the previous discussion, which is most organizations have legacy software. And the legacy software is probably using stuff that is no longer supported. Cyber Essentials says you can only be one major release out of sync. So everything has to be up to date. So in order to get Cyber Essentials Plus, when you do your audit, it's only after you have actually updated all your kit. And that's when you manage it. So I arranged one at Doncaster, and we couldn't do it because we had an emergency flooding. So they said, no, we can't do it now. We'll do it in a month's time. By the month's time it comes out, we hadn't had time to update all our kit again because we've been dealing with the emergency. So we failed our audit because we were 4 months out of date instead of 3 months out of date. So if a large organization like us can't keep on top of things, how can small SMEs keep on top of things? And also, I would say, having not worked in a blue chip in my capacity, we did work for BP, is I actually don't think even large organizations are actually Cyber Essentials Plus. Actually, I think they're just limiting the scope just to be on the one system that they can keep everything up to date and all the governance in place, etc.
Is Cyber Essentials from the National Cyber Security Centre or somebody else?
Sorry?
Cyber Essentials, who?
NCSC.
Yeah.
So a good point. There's quite a few organizations that either provide advice or check that you're doing things correctly. So the ICO, Information Commission's officers, they provide advice, which is generally okay. National Cyber Security Centre came about 10 years ago, 8 years ago. GCHQ provided support to central government about how to securely run their operations, and they had a set of tick boxes. And then the government said, we need more support for public sector. So we'll spin off all the people from the National Cyber Security Centre who provide that sort of support, and we'll call them a new organisation, that's the National Cyber Security Centre. And they had this process of supporting local authorities mostly, and the NHS a bit as well. And what happened was they discovered that a lot of the breaches they were having was because local government had gone through their checklist and ticked off all the things on the checklist that, yeah, we've encrypted our laptops. Well, it didn't have a checkbox that said encrypt our mobile, so we didn't do that. And it didn't have a checkbox to say we have a governance process in place. So like the previous Vicky was saying, people are buying software without checking that they should be buying it or that it meets your standards. So the NCSE says, right, we're giving up on checklists. We're going to just tell you, you've got to worry about stuff. And they gave you a list of things to worry about. And then what you do is you say, yeah, we've worried about all those things. A number of times when I was with Doncaster, we fell foul either of a data breach or a reportable data breach, or a non-reportable data breach that was really quite bad, or a supplier who was bidding for business who failed our checks on it. And in all of those circumstances, the reason they failed was because they weren't approaching security appropriately. So it's a governance issue. So the questions you should be asking are they doing things appropriately? Do they think about things? And if they think about things, or if they don't think about things, So if an organization isn't thinking about something and somebody picks them out and says, you did that wrong, what's your defense? What is their defense? If the ICO says, you bought some software from this organization that said it was ISO 27000 secure, but it's not, you transferred all this secure data to them and they lost it in the cloud.
But it's still your fault, isn't it? The Act actually says that if you send it to a third party, you're responsible for choosing the wrong third party. You get caught in a breach, doesn't it?
Depends on where the data owner is.
Okay.
So sometimes you're actually transferring the risk to them, but you are supposed to, under GDPR, Article 32 says you should be using all appropriate technical and organizational methods to protect the data.
That's why you've got like the shared responsibilities model for cloud, isn't it?
Yeah. Sorry.
I think appropriate is a huge variety of things, because appropriate where you've gone to an organization that does have these credentials, then, you know, how much responsibility do you have to go, oh, they're definitely following it, they're doing that, or they've also been audited and you like, but they say that they do work in this way. So like how far can you
Exactly. Yes.
If an organization's got the certification like ISO 27001, that applies to the organization, not necessarily the work they're doing on your system.
Exactly. Exactly. So totally correct, all three of you. Where does the responsibility for the data reside? Is the organization actually doing what it says it's doing? How good is the auditing of that organization? And
isn't there a problem that if you have a data breach, quite obviously your precautions were not appropriate? So you're appropriate for as long as you don't have a data breach. As soon as you have a data breach, it is clear that your actions were not appropriate because you had a data breach.
okay, name me a bank who hasn't had a data breach.
They will have.
Name me a global supplier that hasn't had a data breach. I can name two actually. So PayPal, when I last checked, had not had a data breach. So apart from PayPal, and I've tried to do a bit of research here, everybody else has had a data breach. All those organizations have got ISO 27001, they've got SOC 1 and 2, they've got Basel, they've got PCI DSS, they've got all these standards, they still have data breaches. So the question, I think, as other people would say, is not that you can always be secure. The answer is, are you appropriately putting enough effort into being secure and reducing the risk?
Having that 2701 doesn't give you that. It's how you implement that 2701 that gives you the appropriateness. Just having 27,001 is potential.
Yeah.
But the procedures and the how well you actually enforce your procedures gives you the actuality of whether you are being appropriate or not.
So part of the challenge here must be that when people implement these standards, they use the terms reasonable and proportionate.
Yeah.
And they underestimate proportionate generally, because they take a risk-based approach to it and then proportionally apply their alignment to the standard, which is usually to worst case,
yeah,
rather than even the median case.
Am I right in thinking that something like ISO 27001 might be controlled their own particular standard? That's when you maybe go to nationally recognized standards like NIST or encryption,
yeah,
stuff like that.
PayPal had a data breach in 2017, affecting 1.6 million people.
Okay, right. I stand corrected.
Even PayPal.
I don't think I trust the ones that say they've had a data breach, unless trust the ones that say they haven't. Because I think they don't know.
Yes,
yes.
And to me, it goes back to, let's say you get to the point you've got a data breach and you've hired or you bought, let's say you bought a cloud product cloud software, or you bought a product off another organization who's managing that information for you. And in the local authority, we would share sensitive children's data with nurseries. And nurseries were businesses that we had a contract with. And they stored that sensitive information on laptops. Did we say they had to be cyber essentials? No, but they should have been cyber essentials because they were providing services to us as an organization. So when I approach that, and I'm trying to pick up what we're saying here, is it's appropriate and it's thinking. So really what we should be doing is asking, okay, a standard's good, and a well-audited standard is really good, but really, are they thinking about it and are they doing what we think is appropriate? Does a small organization know what's appropriate from a security or risk perspective, especially if we as a large organization are buying a product off them? We might buy the same product off lots of small organizations. Do we as a large organization know what we think is appropriate? So shouldn't that be our standard?
Yes.
Should we ignore all these things and just say, these are the standards that we think are appropriate?
What happens though, if you also buy on price and the people that do actually do what you think is appropriate have to charge more than the people that just say they're doing what's appropriate? And if you will only pay the least cost, you're effectively saying, we expect you to lie to us fairly convincingly.
So one of the things I think is appropriate is governance. So you collect data, you use data, you might send data somewhere, you then retain it, and then you destroy it. So you do lots of things with data. And so all of those things should have policies and procedures associated with them. So if you're going to work with an organization, have you got all those policies and procedures? That's a question to ask. If they lie to you, then you've got a position to sue them when they get it wrong, haven't you?
If they don't like you, if they point to the book of procedures for destruction of data on the shelf, and you look at that book and it's got a 6-inch layer of dust on top of it, so it's never ever been opened, they are not lying to you. They have the procedures, but they're not enforcing the procedure.
So we go back to when you get to a breach or a drop in contract or something goes wrong, you can sue somebody, or one of the regulators can impose a fine on you because you've done something wrong. And they will inevitably impose a fine on something when you have not thought about it. And part of the reason GDPR came in and the 2% and 4% fines for GDPR was that large organizations looked at risk and said, it was too expensive. Marks and Spencer's back in the 90s had thousands, tens of thousands of laptops. And they said, it's too expensive to encrypt them all. If we lose some data, the ICO can only fine us 500,000 quid. That's way less than encrypting all our laptops. That's an acceptable risk.
So do you think in large organisations, which normally have risks at the board level, at the council, at board level, you don't need to know what encryption is, you just need to know what your risk is and you get to manage it. In large organisations that do have supplier assurance, so they can do a bit of digging to find out whether what a supplier is saying, they've got the evidence, but whereas in a small to medium enterprises, you may not have that capacity or funding to do it.
Yes, I do think that's the case. And what I'm going to do is just go back to those lists of things that I think you should do, because even a large organizer can check those dead easy. And that means, in my book, when you go to the ICO, the FCA, Financial Conduct Authority, you say, I've looked at this. I queried the fact that they might be lying, but they convinced me. They had the standard. They showed me the procedure. I've personally received doctored Excel files where the metadata doesn't actually match what's in the Excel file, where they proved that they were compliant. Why am I going back? Oh, right, okay. So when I was looking personally, I was thinking, well, Cyber Essentials is not a particularly good standard of quality. How can you check people's governance and approach? I went around the UK and said, who has got a decent standard? So I went to the NHS, and the NHS have a code of connection. So they require organisations that connect to them and have access to patient data to have a number of standards. And as Doncaster Council, we were allowed to connect that. It's a long document that said, here's the proof that we have all these controls in place. But then I discovered that nursing care, not nursing care, nurseries and care homes both connected to the NHS. And I knew lots of them couldn't even pass Cyber Essentials, even the non-audited one. So how were they connecting? And they had a light version. So I checked out the NHS Connection Lite, and it doesn't include a requirement to authenticate to the equipment that you use or to encrypt the equipment that you use. So if you broke into a care home and stole the laptops, you could just get all the access to the data. Their Lite didn't include that. So they didn't have what I thought was a good enough standard. Crown Commercial Services is what provides G-Cloud 7, and lots of organisations buy off G-Cloud. Our coroner system, which was due up for renewal, they wanted to buy a system and they'd run out of time. So they had to buy a system off the peg. So they went to Crown Commercial Services, and Civica had a system that loads of coroners used. So they said, we want to buy the Civica system. So I said, well, dead people, somebody will catch me out on it. Dead people don't actually have any data rights. So under GDPR, it doesn't cover dead people stuff. But when you're interviewing to find out why somebody died, you might pick up health data about people who are still alive. So the system has to be fully secure. And Civica was ISO 27001 certified, full certification. They had an online data sharing process, so an online data file process. So when the coroner investigates a death, quite often somebody has done something wrong, and most organisations don't like to admit publicly that they've done something wrong. So the coroner now can ask them to provide two reports, one where they admit exactly what they did wrong and provide that to the coroner, and one where they don't admit exactly what went wrong and they provide that to the public. So both of those go into the secure area that they share, and then the coroner pulls up all the actual confidential reports with all the nitty-gritties and comes to a conclusion. And then in the process of the public coroner's display, then shares the correct, also the redacted data, if you like. So it doesn't say this particular doctor in this hospital did it wrong, and that's why the person died. So I thought, well, it's kind of really important that ISO 27001 is appropriate for that data sharing. So I emailed the sales guy and said, what's the scope for ISO 27001? And they said, it's our financial system. We have to have it in place for a financial system, because otherwise we can't get any of those contracts. So does a coroner system use a financial system? No. So what G-Cloud, what Crown Commercial Services had said was they had allowed Civica to say that particular software was ISO 27001, whereas it was actually just for something else within the organisation, not for them. So my argument is the NHS weren't really asking the right questions. Crown Commercial Service wasn't actually checking to see if what they said was applicable. The Scottish Government had decided on Cyber Essentials. That was their brilliant solution. And I went to my colleagues in Yorkshire and Humber and said, there must be a better way of doing this, because all these other standards are crap, because they don't either check or they don't pick up on when people are lying. What things should we be lying about? And so we all got together and said, let's come up with something that's good enough for us. And then if any supplier wants to sell to any one of us, and that's NHS, fire, police, or local authority within Yorkshire and Humber, if they've done it for one of us, they don't have to do it again. So it's a win for small to medium agencies, but it's also a win for us because we know the guys that we all work with and we can trust them. So I've had lots of examples where when I've done the due diligence, people have lied. And the usual way they've lied is by saying, we have that standard. And then I say, when you look at all their answers, and they're all answers, so they respond to the 15-page questionnaire in 2 days. You're thinking, it's quite quick. Could you give me a copy of your policies? You can redact them if you want to. Silence. They haven't written them yet. They've got them, but they just haven't written them yet. Or can you give me a redacted copy of when everybody finished their data protection training, which should be at least every 2 years. And I did this with one organization that was a consultant to a number of local authorities who had a data breach. So we sent them a load of sensitive child data. They did some number crunching on it. We sent it encrypted. They sent it between themselves encrypted, and then they sent it to the wrong person within our organization, unencrypted, who said, that's not right. I investigated and I said, you're all consultants, small organization, 20 people, you're all consultants, you all used to work in public sector. When did you do your data protection training? Oh, we all did it when we started. How often do you do it afterwards? Do we need to do it afterwards? Were they taking security seriously, bearing in mind that that's all they did is they sold to local authorities and they were all experts in their field? They probably did, but it didn't look like they were. So one option is you just tick all the boxes and nobody will check. You give it to somebody who doesn't know what they're talking about. So when they lie to me, they're being really convincing because they believe it to be true. So again, we were buying a piece of youth software, and when I checked, they were using MD5 as their hashing algorithm, which was deprecated about 15 years ago. So I wrote to them and I said, in your project process, you refer to MD5. What's your plan to replace that, if you have a plan? There's no plan. There's nothing wrong with that. Well, we can't buy it because it's using outdated software. Just a moment. What do you mean we can't buy? You won't buy it? Restrict the scope. So ISO 27001, you can't apply it to the whole organization because it's just too difficult to achieve that. So you apply it to a small part of the organization. So just lie about which bit you've applied it to. Civica, Crown Commercial Services, didn't ask Civica to state that the ISO scope applied to the coroner system. They just said, have you got ISO 2001? So you can kind of lie about that as well. And they managed to get away with it. I was the only person who ever checked them.
Question for you. You just talked about like making sure people have the latest versions or whatever and they're up to date, etc. I've just come from a presentation previously where we talked about having an alternative third party doing management of an old version, not having to keep up to date. So we have this kind of concept that we have to keep modernizing. So when standards are written on saying you have to have the most modern, doesn't probably necessarily mean it's the most secure.
That's true. And what I go back to is if Doncaster Council couldn't even achieve that, we had loads of legacy systems, which we couldn't make secure because they just wouldn't support the latest encryption systems. So what we did is we said, okay, we have a risk owner or a risk approver. We have technical processes in place. How can we mitigate it? So when we had a breach, which we haven't had since 2016, when we had a breach, what happened was we said, these are our processes. We're on top of it most of the time, but in some circumstances we're not. And the regulator said, you're taking it seriously. Get on with it. Not, well, you know, we wrote something 15 years ago and we've never looked at it again. Well, we'll fine you then. And I'll give you an example. In Leeds Social Services, about 10 years ago, they didn't have enough laptops to go around. So the adult social care workers shared laptops, and their system didn't allow for didn't have enough licenses to pay for individual logins to that software. So they had group logins. And so you didn't know which laptop you're going. So you had to have the password for that particular system on the laptop. And one of the people, social care workers, left their laptop in one of the client's houses, and the client accessed all the details and then said, this is a bit wrong, and told the ICO. And the ICO said,
So wasn't that person then in breach of the Computer Use Act?
Absolutely.
Computer without, so presumably the company was fine and the person went to prison. Is that how the ICO handled that?
It's a good question. The ICO doesn't prosecute many individuals. I think in the last 2 years, they've prosecuted one individual, and it's usually where it's an employee who's stolen data when they shouldn't have stolen data. So the ICO is unlikely to pick up on that, and the police, which would go for the Computer Misuse Act, are unlikely to pick up on that because there's no particular harm. GDPR talks about harm or probable harm. So if you have an information breach, but there's no probable harm, then the likelihood is that the ICO will take no action. Okay, so Leeds, ICO found out that Leeds had laptops that people didn't authenticate to, or if they did authenticate to them, it was easy to guess what the password was, and said, sort it. 18 months later, so Leeds Social Services said, well, we need more laptops then, and IT said, well, we can't give you any more laptops, you have to buy them yourselves, and they said, okay, we'll put a budget in request, etc. 18 months later, they had another breach, and the ICO said, we told you to sort this out. It's 18 months later, you haven't sorted it out. So, well, we're working on it. It's not good enough. £80,000 fine. So what the ICO seems to do is take a fine between 80 and 150 grand for local authorities, which is enough to make them really smart, but not enough to stop them from providing their services. Interestingly, the ICO fined the Cabinet Office £500,000 for losing the New Year's honours list, because they thought, well, you can afford that.
If you can't get approval to buy the extra laptops you need, how are you going to do it when you're £80,000 poorer?
I use that example a lot to try and get the money for stuff. So what I'm saying is, if you aren't doing it seriously, then the organisations that monitor or can punish you will take a dim view of it. Whereas if you are taking it, or you can prove you're taking it seriously, even if you're not doing it, but you're kind of taking it seriously, they tend to just warn you rather than fine you. So that's kind of my argument here, is if you're buying software or buying a product off an organisation and they are taking it seriously, then that's good. And if they're not taking it seriously, it's bad. So if you're that organisation, have these things in place. So
And presumably also you want people to at least have heard of the terms. So when the auditor comes up and says about the GDPO section X, Y, Z, you don't want the person in your organisation to say, oh, what section is that? Well, I've never heard of that.
There's quite a few different ways of attacking some of these problems. And in fact, from the other presentations we've seen, we've talked about a lot about how the complexity of the IT is. And I didn't really want to go down that route because I wanted to go back to what the basics are. What if you haven't done these basics, if you haven't got the governance in place, if you haven't got the training in place, if you haven't got a retention policy, it doesn't matter how old it is, it looks like you're not taking it seriously. And then either you'll get fined, or if you're actually buying that product, you shouldn't be buying that product because they're just not taking it seriously. There's other organizations. So there's various reasons why you can't do that. I would just say, if you can, put it in the cloud, because the main cloud providers, AWS, Azure, etc., have actually got all of this ticked off, all the basic stuff ticked off. You still have to configure it. You still have to make sure that your authentication is right, but most of that stuff is already ticked off in there. So if you can put your data in there, it doesn't mean that you can get rid of legacy. So you still got your legacy to protect. So these are kind of the ones that if you don't get right now, you will probably get fined for, because they're expected to be appropriate and everybody knows they're appropriate. So the device is not encrypted. In our organization, Doncaster, a few years ago, we had KitKat Android devices, which is Android 5. They still worked. Why replace them? Somebody had cut the budget and said, you could save 30,000 quid by not replacing this kit, it still works. So there you go, £30,000 saved, great. KitKat didn't encrypt by standard, it only encrypted by standard Android 6. So I said, well, if we lose any of these and the ICO finds out, then they're just going to throw the book at us. They're going to fine us because we've lost data that we didn't have to lose. That got them all upgraded. Again, sensitive data unencrypted. We all share, a lot of people share data in OneDrive, personal OneDrive. You don't know it's there. It's not encrypted. If you're going to share it encrypted where you can see it. Data protection, we've already covered that. Governance kind of covered that. Critical vulnerabilities, picked up really early, is that all I'm talking about is what you can check with the supplier. You're not actually checking the system they're selling. There is a process for producing code securely, but it's not a standard, it's a process. So you can't say, do you adhere to that standard? What you can ask them is how many CVSS, critical vulnerability software security, CVSS 10 plus issues they have in their software. So they should have ran a checker against their software, and it's got any CVSS 10 plus, have a process in place to fix it. And you can ask them that, and if they haven't checked it, then don't buy the software, because they're just not taking it seriously. Oh, data protection fee, classic one. Somebody bid for our business, and they hadn't registered with the ICO for the data protection fee, which is for a small organisation, 35 quid for a year. So how seriously are they taking data protection? Privacy notice. Lots of organisations had privacy notices. So when we had the Data Protection Act 2018, it replaced the previous Data Protection Act 1998. And the 1998 suggested that you should have a privacy notice. So most people thought, I've got a privacy notice, it's on my website, and it refers to the wrong law. So how seriously are you taking security if you haven't updated your privacy notice to reflect the laws that cover what your customers are using your data for? And those are easy to check. So if you go to an organization, does Cyber Essentials say that the privacy notice has to be relevant? No. Did Cyber Essentials say that you have to data project? It does actually. But a lot of these things, Cyber Essentials doesn't say you have to do. So that's why I'm saying don't use Cyber Essentials as good enough. Check these things. That's it. Any questions?
Well, it just seems to me that this risk management is fine until you actually get caught. And if you lose the data of somebody who's famous, a celebrity, you're likely to find that your guardrails were not effective enough because they're famous, because the papers pick up it and so on. So you really need to do some a role-playing game or so as to what will happen if this stuff gets loose to the papers. Do we have people in our books that are so famous that however small the breach is, it'll be splashed across all the papers, whereupon it's very hard not for the ICO not to take it seriously, and do a few role-playing games as to what will actually happen to this stuff.
Obviously, my background is local authorities and the public sector for the last sort of 20 years. So I've not got a good handle of what the risks are within blue chips organizations. But in reality, as you quite rightly say, you take a risk assessment, and that's why the MCSC changed their guidance. So they have the 12 guiding principles cloud service, and they talk about having an asset management register.
Yeah.
So when we had GDPR, everybody had to have an information register. So everybody has an information register, everybody has a software asset register, everybody has a physical IT register. So when you look across all of those things, you probably also then have a cloud register, very difficult to find, obviously, because people can just get it off a credit card. They don't necessarily have to go through any procurement process. So you have all these registers, and then you review across all of those registers what your risks are. You know where your assets are, what your information are, what processes you're doing, what are your risks against those registers. And then you've got the semblance of a governance.
If you talk to people about their risk management, though, you often find that they just haven't thought about most of the risks. They just wave their hands and assume the risk of happening quite small. You know, what reason do you have for saying the risk is small? Mine know it sounds small to me. You know, it's fairly obvious they haven't actually really thought about the risk.
But they've started thinking about it. And
That's
my
nothing,
argument
yeah.
is when one of the ICO, the FCA, starts investigating that something bad's happened,
Yeah.
have you started thinking about it? Now, the question then goes to what you were saying earlier, is that an appropriate level of thinking about it or resources into it?
Is it hard to have like a cloud asset register when cloud and scalability, something you buy services a cloud, so you may not know where your data is stored because you leave it up to the cloud provider?
Connect with the Amazon dashboard.
Go ahead.
Yeah. Just wondering, someone's going through due diligence, some SME, and they get to a certain point in it and say, but you're not giving us any personal data, you're not giving us any sensitive data, that's not the service we're providing to you. What happens at that point? Because this has been useful for public authorities and due diligence there. But if someone's saying, well, we might be doing something important for you, but we're doing nothing with personal information.
Well, it goes back to the risk or the impact of the loss of that data. So I have also signed off on contracts like you. We had a number of, what do they call them, street cleaners type people who went around sorting out stuff, and they found trolleys. And the main manufacturer of trolleys, which is a European company, had a community team. And their community team worked with local authorities and other organisations collecting trolleys that had been dumped. And you could report where those trolleys were on their app. They didn't pay a data protection fee. I was saying, we can't use software where the people who producing the software haven't paid the data protection fee because they knew the people who are using the app. Now, what's the risk of somebody hacking that company and picking up all the street officers' names and then pursuing them? I think negligible. There wasn't any real risk, but they hadn't paid 35 quid to register with the data protection officer, data protection office in the UK. I think
the only thing would be if you're talking about the manufacturers of trolleys, they're not going to be a small business. So if they register with the ICO, it's not going to be the 35 quid unless that community team is a separate ring fence company. It's going to be
you're
a much
right.
larger amount.
You're right. It's about £4,000 for a large organisation, but it also relates to how much data you're processing. So I think there are several tiers, but yes, it isn't just 35 quid. But quite a lot of apps are just small one-man band producing an app that everybody thinks is fantastic. Like our traffic wardens actually used apps rather than any software to check the the registration numbers of cars that were parked illegally, because it was too long-winded to get the secure laptop off and log into the ANPR system. So they would actually use an app to check it, but they didn't check with IT that the apps they were buying were actually reasonable and had security in place and weren't using that data inappropriately. So I think, in my view, you're right. If the risk of the data that you're going to lose isn't going to have a huge impact, you don't need to check a lot of this stuff. But most people do. Most data you do. A classic case was at the start of lockdown, our organisation started producing drop-in clinics for LFTs. And so they created a new front end on the Doncaster Government website and said you can log in and book an LFT appointment. And as part of that process, they by default checked to see if you had any allergies, which is sensitive data. In order to book that appointment, they used a bit of software called Calendly, which is used by central government, by many blue chips, etc. And Calendly is an American company, so that data was going to America. Now, if you share data with American companies, you are protected by EU-US Privacy Shield.
Used to be.
That'd be scrapped, isn't it?
Yes, it was shown as not providing the, but it's reasonable to suggest that if you checked to make sure that your supplier was in the EU-US Privacy Shield, then you've done an appropriate level of checking. Except Calendly had only applied to have their software sanctioned, but it hadn't been approved. And the application process was 2 years old. And I checked and said, are you going to complete this? And they said, well, you're the only people who have asked, so no. So I went back to public health and said, yeah, if you want to carry on using Calendly, fine, but just don't capture any personal sensitive data. They said, that's fine. What we'll do is we'll get people to ask the people that information when they come in. We're not sharing that with America. So I think, yes, you need to know what you've got and you need to know what the risks are and you need to have thought about it. And that's all I'm saying is you need to have thought about it. If somebody signed off and said, I think that risk is low, the chances are an expert would say, that's reasonable. And that's all you want, an expert to say, that's a reasonable approach to that risk, and therefore we're not going to fine you, or we're not going to sue you.